Welcome to the Self Reflections podcast, where real reflections are shared by real people. Today's guest is Rob Connolly from Charleston, USA. Expect this episode to be deeply reflective, exploring identity, inauthenticity, trauma, adaptations, and self-destruction. Rob, welcome to the Self Reflections podcast. I appreciate you being here and sharing your journey.
Absolutely. I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Rob, your journey is one of incredible transformation, learning to shed a life that was no longer serving you and stepping into something more authentic. Before we get into the deeper aspects of your story, can you introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background on what led you to this point?
Yeah. So I am a spiritual being having a human experience here on this earth, and basically had to lose the version of myself that I had known for 38 years in order to find what I believe to be my true self. And that involved an enormous amount of change and the need to confront basically every aspect of who I thought I was in a pretty short period of time. Went through a divorce, went through deconstruction from not only my faith, but I was also a Christian pastor. And so that then sent me on a multi-pivot career change scenario. And all of this was happening at the same time. And so, basically I got to the opportunity to ask myself all the fundamental questions, and figure out from scratch, who am I?
Mm-hmm. And that's so powerful. And thank you for bringing your story to our community, because many of us do feel stuck in the life that we had chosen to lead and not feeling fulfilled by it, and feeling quite stuck in not knowing what to do. And I think your story, and the reason why I resonated to it, was because there was that shedding of everything that you built, which is so scary for anyone of us to even fathom is an option for us when we have been programmed to go from one thing to another, and then really ingraining ourselves with that identity and not thinking that there is a separate version of us to everything that is external to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the way that the mind works is typically to promote safety. We justify or look for data that backs up what we already believe to be true about ourselves and the external world. And so it's very unusual that that safety mechanism can be shut off in a comprehensive enough way to reinvent yourself completely, without there being catastrophic consequences. And some could argue that in my story there are some catastrophic consequences, but I'm here, and every day I wake up and I ask the universe to put me where I'm most needed, and I'm following the inward path towards enlightenment and peace, and experiencing quite a bit of love and beauty every day. So I'm not just surviving, I'm not just at a place where I'm breathing air. And I think that is sort of the indicator that I would say for anyone. If you feel as though you are just barely breathing air, you're not connected to anything that feels meaningful to you in your life. If survival is your only goal, then you can stop where you are and begin the process of asking these fundamental questions. You don't have to wait until everything becomes incredibly catastrophically difficult to ask these questions. And so that would be one of the reasons that I tell my story, and one of the reasons I'm grateful to come on the show, is in hopes that people who are maybe at that place of, I'm just trying to make it, I hope Friday comes, I hope my vacation next month comes, but we're not finding meaning in the daily life. We're not finding connection to something that is deeper than just, next paycheck or whatever it is, that you can actually ask those questions whenever you want.
And I love that, because there's no blueprint for it, and there's no need for permission or for it to get horrifically challenging for you to be able to start those curious explorations of self, you know. I love that you've identified that, especially for some of our listeners that sometimes minimize, oh, it's not as bad for me now, okay, we'll just leave it, you know, and I won't explore that, and I'll just keep going. So
That's very common.
Rob, yeah, no, absolutely. Rob, you had a very public identity as a pastor, as a husband, a father, and a leader, but behind closed doors, you very much, I remember you mentioning in our discovery call, you were crumbling. Can you describe what that disconnect felt like for you at that time?
I think crumbling is a pretty good word. The way I would put it is, in order to keep up what I would call a pretty genuine persona, but a persona nonetheless, that, you know, these
Yeah.
are these are my values, this is who I am, this is my identity. Um, so much sacrifice of who I really was required that I didn't even know who that person was back behind
Mm,
outward facade. And I would say outward facade meaning literally in my own home. uh,
yeah.
every human being in the world, I was this thing that I had convinced myself that I was. And for me, that comes from a number of well-meaning moments as early as just a few months old, being dedicated into the Christian church, uh,
Mhm.
before I could even walk, and the idea that I come from the love of God and I'm given back to the love of God, and a very narrow idea of what that means and what that makes me, and trying to be faithful to that idea of who I was from a very, very young age. It became essentially the smaller sandbox that I was playing in.
Yeah.
And so, I really struggled to even understand that there was anything wrong. And one of the key, and I'm sure we'll get a chance to get into the depths of this, one of the key theological or belief mechanisms within many Christian systems is the idea of self-sacrifice, and the idea that there is virtue in putting yourself last in every room you're in every relationship.
Mm,
And this is extremely prevalent in marriage because of what I believe to be some misinterpretations of a couple of key verses, where, specifically for men who are to
yeah.
mimic what Christians believe Christ has done for the church, and that is to die for the church. And
Yeah.
I actually had
Hmm.
that verse inscribed on the inside of the wedding ring in my first marriage. And so
Hmm.
I actually believed that it was my God given duty to sacrifice myself for
Mm,
being in happiness of my spouse in my first marriage in such a way that I didn't even examine this. This was not something that was like, this doesn't feel right. In fact,
yeah.
my belief system was that if I had a doubt or a question, that was sin. And
Mm,
so there was no permission to even ask those questions. Now, given that, I think it's important to understand, I was as genuine as I knew how to be
hmm.
in my life. And
Hmm.
it wasn't until the stress of it became uh,
Yeah.
unsustainable, and
Hmm.
there's a common term in religious trauma where uh, it's called a dual life, where you don't even realize in many cases you've done it, but you have a separate set of thought patterns, and that turns into a separate set of behaviors, and then that
Hmm.
begins to break through into the facade, and then eventually the facade crumbles. And so
Hmm.
for a very long time I didn't even realize this was happening, but I had an entire thought life that was in contradiction to my believed beliefs. I believed these things. But I also had a thought life that was in contradiction to that. So what really began to crumble was my ability to sustain that version of myself that was not genuine to me as it became more difficult, as the marriage became more difficult, as the variables with my role as a pastor became more difficult, as financial difficulties cropped up and increased. The reality was that I was not actually that person, and so that broke through.
I loved the metaphor of the sandbox. We know what we know, and we don't know what we don't know. And I what I really enjoyed about what you just mentioned, there's a few points there that really stuck out to me. The way that you referred to your belief system being made, and naturally it was through religion that you're sharing this story with, and we can identify so many men, irrespective of what, what beliefs they grew up with, have some of these themes and narratives instilled in them, that they do have to break themselves for the benefit of others, and that they can't complain about it, and they can't show the weight of that on them. And I think that's a really important point there, that you and many men get forced into this life of just giving and giving and bleeding out, and never asking for help, and never acknowledging the challenge that that is, to a point where it no longer, like you've mentioned, the facade breaks. The facade no longer serves us, and it sees us and in our action as the threat, and it no longer is something that we can then hold all together like we would prior to that. The other thing you mentioned as well is, oh, my brain just left me. There's so many good points. But I guess through your experience, you started to see that there comes a turning point when we use that facade, and even though it is a genuine at the time facade that we are engaging in, it is, like you said, still a facade that can only take you so far.
Yeah, and for me, there was not enough self-awareness to sort of prevent
Mm.
cataclysm. And
Mm-hmm.
um, one of the things I'd love to share with you and the audience is that I've always been a songwriter, and there was a 20-year period of time where I did not make my own music, and I helped other people with their music. I even owned a recording studio for a little while. I made a lot of church music, but I did not make my own music. And one of the first songs that I wrote during this period of major transition is called The Reckoning. And there's this idea in the song that really I think is relevant here, and that is that there was always a reckoning coming one day. I needed correction for a runaway life. That's how the chorus begins. And, I think the reckoning for me was more painful than it had to be. Um, Certainly could have ended much worse, but the reality is that there were plenty of signs. There were plenty of markers along the path that I either was not equipped to recognize, or I was unwilling to recognize. And I would say that this is one of the real dangers in high control religion, is the systems are designed to rewire your safety mechanisms away from trusting yourself, and away from even believing that any idea or thought or concern or question or doubt that you might have is acceptable. It's
Mm.
conformity. And
Mm.
and so if the danger is in trusting yourself, then when your inner voice tries to speak to you, you're afraid of it. You
Yeah.
actually see it as pushing you farther from your creator. And so this is a major, major, major problem with high control religion, that almost builds a mold for inauthenticity, and 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 melts everybody down and pours them into the mold. And then there you are, remade into this inauthentic image of something that you are not. Um, and so when I work with people in religious trauma and deconstruction, the number one thing that I tell them is, you're still in there. You're not lost.
Mm-hmm.
You have gone through an experience that your nervous system was ill-equipped to handle, and that required you to learn to distrust yourself. But if you're asking these questions even now, and I would say this to anybody who's just starting to ask questions about their religious experience, or who they are, the fact that you're asking those questions, the fact that you're listening to this
Mm.
podcast right now, the fact that you are interested in books that might help you, the fact that you're willing to talk to a friend,
Mm.
neighbor, or a family member, the fact that there are little glimmers of that little flame that pop out every now and again, that is your higher inner self poking through. You are not lost. And so
Mm.
to cling to those uh, is to rediscover yourself, to begin to put your feet on the path of healing, to reclaim anything that has been lost temporarily. And that certainly was the case for me.
Mm. And naturally, when we're trying to go with these different versions of ourselves to please others and to keep ourselves safe within the parameters of what we grew up with, um, naturally we get signs that something is inauthentic, and that's what you kind of described there. It's these little points of curiosity and questioning and discomfort, and things stop sitting right, and you might not necessarily have an idea of what that is exactly to begin with. Like you said, at first there's a lot of limited insight with majority of us, and that is a slow process. um, did you feel like, were there more signs for you that led you down that path of acknowledging that, okay, this is inauthentic and this isn't where I need to be? And then how did you slowly start to, like, what was the particular moment that then helped you realize something had to change?
Yeah.
If
So,
there was one, of course.
yeah, unfortunately, the introspection and sort of, wait a minute, what has happened here moment did not come for me until I had attempted to take my own life. And so I woke up hanging from an eighth floor balcony and had no recollection of how I arrived there. I had been abusing alcohol that evening as a coping mechanism, and my spouse at the time was asleep in the room where we were staying, and I had just decided to climb out over the balcony. I was done, I guess. And what woke me up from that drunken stupor was the picture of my children, their faces.
Yeah.
And I was only awake for about 30 seconds, long enough to crawl back over the balcony railing and fall asleep right there. And that's where I woke up the next morning. And I remember thinking, wow, okay, who am I even?
Yeah, good
Because
question.
I was still a pastor at the time.
Mm,
I was giving, talks about finding hope in something that wasn't giving me hope. And it
wow.
really hit me that there was an incongruence for
Mm,
me in my life that had to be dealt with. Now, ironically, because I was also working a job at the time, I had a sales meeting in 1 hour on this trip and had to get ready and go. And there was like no time. And there was, okay, well, I can't really deal with this right now. I have to, and then you're on and you can zoom in. And so I would just say that busyness in general and obligation and our culture of distraction
mm,
and the need to be constantly stimulated by external things is the biggest enemy to the path of healing from within, to the path of
mm.
self. And that certainly was the case for me. We all have work, we all have bills, we all have things that we like to do for entertainment. Certainly, in the age of the internet, there's never really an end to the things that we can entertain ourselves with. But I would say that for me, between the belief system that I had and the number of things keeping me busy and engaged, even that moment of the balcony was not the moment where I began the work.
Interesting.
And it wasn't until my marriage dissolved about
Mm,
7 months after that. And
mhm,
I was looking into the faces of those children again, and they were asking me, what happened
mm.
to our life, Dad? I had a
Yeah.
kindergartner. My daughter was in kindergarten, and Dad's moving out, and she now has two families, and it doesn't make sense and what's going on. And
Mhm.
at that moment, I picked up a book that I had bought 2 years prior called "The Body Keeps the Score." And I really didn't know at the time why I bought the book, um,
Mm,
but I had packed up, a couple of cases of books when we had moved, and I found at the top of one of those cases of the books was this one book, The Body Keeps the Score, that I had never read, even though I'd had it for a couple of years.
yeah.
And I had just begun asking myself the question, within a couple of weeks of that time, how did I get here and why do I behave in ways that I don't understand? And for any of your listeners who aren't familiar with that book, it is a really great introduction to the way trauma works in rewiring your brain. And trauma is not the thing that happens to you. Trauma is your brain's adaptation and your body's adaptation to surviving the thing that happened to you.
Yes.
And so essentially, I had adapted to 1,000 ways of surviving that were actually killing and that were in accordance with my actual values. But what I realized pretty quickly is that, okay, I can understand that my behaviors are coming from these survival adaptations, much like the way, a war veteran might, hear a car backfire and in their experience, what they're experiencing is the war all over again, right? And for me, it was much smaller little nuggets of moments where I didn't feel safe in different ways. And so my body and my brain were trying to keep me safe, but what I was really doing was self-destruct, right? And that's a really important thing to understand, is that people with complex post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, or even who have gone through abusive relationships or have been in abusive religious environments, have made adaptations to survive situations that often are no longer serving us well, and are not really healthy over the long term if those adaptations, when the nervous system doesn't reset, when the nervous system doesn't go back to a safe state, we stay in a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And I'm basically just giving a lecture on trauma at this point. But this was me. I was living in this response state to an entire life that was not safe.
And I want to go back and thank you for sharing such a vulnerable moment in your life, and it sounds like challenging and dark moment where, without much recollection of an understanding of why in that time, you had a choice point, and without then coming to, naturally, our mind looks for anything to try and take itself out of the pain that it's enduring, and suicide is naturally entertained as one of those options. And I do appreciate you sharing such a challenging moment for you, for the benefit of our community. The other thing, Rob, as you've mentioned, and I very much second this, psychological research very much highlights that chronic inauthenticity, where your external self does not align with your internal self, can lead to absolute extreme emotional exhaustion, anxiety, even, as we know, depression, which then can easily flow on into this state of hopelessness, helplessness, and then we are skating on a very thin ice in the experience of, is my life worth living? And that's where, when we do engage in coping mechanisms, like you mentioned, some substances, that ice gets very thin and it starts to crack, and we can easily fall through. And when we feel trapped in our roles that we've outgrown, that no longer serve us, it's this perpetuating pressure cooker that just keeps, getting intense. And there will come a point, not if it's when that point comes, where we do find that explosion, and it then manifests itself in sometimes self-harm, in suicide attempts, and so forth and so on. And going further into what you've mentioned there, the book Body Keeps the Score, and anyone who's ever worked with trauma, and I have very much, it's on my mantle. I read it regularly, I refer to it regularly, because Bessel van der Kolk and his team of researchers have done such amazing work in us being able to understand the impacts of all trauma on the body. And I'll definitely put the link to the book in the description below for our community who wishes to read it for themselves. But it's, when I first was working with trauma, there was not there wasn't much books that help you understand it on a deeper level, and it was probably one of the first and most regarded books that everyone now refers to. And the more research that comes out in the impact of trauma on the brain and body, we find that more research, more books, and more understanding is then available to us. So I do appreciate and thank you for sharing that aspect of your, I guess, hopelessness, and also then how that slowly then led you into connecting with something that helps you then understand, well, why did I choose that in that moment? You know, because no one just freely chooses suicide as an option. There has to come a breaking point that really genuinely makes beautiful sense. And we want to normalize that as well to some of our community who entertain the idea. It's not to say that we want to promote it, but it's also just normalizing that it will make sense if a person gets to a point where it's no longer something that that living no longer feels like it's an option for them. And in that breath, I also want to highlight that you're never alone in your suffering. We will definitely be putting some resources in our description below for individuals who do feel like they're at that level of hopelessness. That is the only option that they are entertaining. So it's definitely opened up so many, discussion points of what you had to go through, your learning process as well, and then what probably then boosted you into the journey of your own recovery and exploration. So in summarizing all that, where did that lead you after you really started to get a handle and understanding or a concept of my body and my mind? I've actually been traumatized by what I've endured, and my body's having these natural reactions to my body storing that trauma within itself. Where did that lead you?
Yeah, I mean, the first step for me was learning how to regulate my nervous system in
Yeah.
a moment by moment, sort of status real time way. Because to recognize that I was constantly dysregulated, that I was in a trauma response almost all the time, and that my body's symptoms were classified as anxiety or they were classified as depression. And, I worked with a psychiatrist very briefly who basically just said, look, these symptoms are consistent with these diagnoses, and I think these are the medications that are going to help you. And I'm certainly not anti-medication. In fact, I was on those medications for a period of time when I simply had no coping skills, and quite frankly, had no idea how to regulate my nervous system. But what I realized is that as I was on those medications, it was about a 2 to 3 month period of time in my case. Certainly not a prescription for anyone else's story, but that is mine. And during that time, I began to understand what nervous system regulation looked like. I began to work with my breath. I began to recognize the signs of when my nervous system was dysregulated and begin to be present with myself. This was also only about 2 to 3 months after I had read The Body Keeps the Score, right after the separation of my first marriage. And then I stumbled upon a book called The Power of Now by Agnes Lee. And one of the main reasons I ended up pursuing my journey apart from medication long term is that I found that the regulation that the medication was offering me was actually hampering my ability to regulate myself. And so my ability to go past the sort of stable place and go deeper and understand what I was feeling in my body, which I began to learn through a number of resources. After I learned about being present in the now, which, by the way, it's another wonderful book for people who are asking the big questions about what it means to be a human. But I recognized that in every now that I was in, I could only go so deep. And so I eventually moved away from the medications, and a couple of months went by, and it was up and down, and it was more of a time where I was learning ideas. I wasn't putting them in practice in a particularly effective way. And then I went away for a vacation in the mountains. And I woke up one morning and there was no internet. and there was nothing to do. And I made some coffee and I sat down. It was really quiet. And an hour went by and I realized I had run out of thought.
Mm-hmm.
And I lost track of time. I had to get up and I think I unplugged the refrigerator because I could start to hear the refrigerator. You know, there was a clock on the mantle across. I had to go put it in the other room. I had a recalibration of my nerve
Of your senses.
to the point that
Mm-hmm.
I could actually hear myself. And I don't mean a thought.
Mm-hmm.
You know, my cognitive mind was really good at running like this. You know, people say to me sometimes, "Oh, you're so smart." I'm like, "Oh, like this thing between my ears will wear me smack out if I'm not careful."
Yes.
What I've learned is that my mind is not me, and my mind is much like one of my hands. I can actually control my mind with my higher self's values. But it took
Mm-hmm.
stumbling into 7 hours alone with myself that day in the mountains and actually choosing to keep in that discomfort because the first 5 minutes you're like, all right, where's my phone? There's got to be input somewhere. There's got to be some kind of input that I can find because I need inputs. And I think we
Mm-hmm.
become very addicted to input. You know, we become very
Mm-hmm.
addicted to external stimulation. And what I came to see during that time is that I could actually expand my consciousness once my cognitive mind actually finally shushed up and quieted down. And
Mm-hmm.
that I know a lot of really cool stuff about myself that I didn't stop thinking long enough to know or hear until that moment. And so
Mm-hmm.
I kind of stumbled into consciousness expansion as a tool. I didn't even realize that that's what it was. So for me, it was I have something would come up for me, a memory or a feeling or an experience, and I would say, well, where do I feel that in my body? What do I associate with that feeling? Where does that come from? I started to become just an observer of this experience, and all of these things, all these traumatic moments, all these happy, joyful moments started to come up for me, and I could actually observe myself in my body experiencing those things. I didn't even know this was a thing, this consciousness expansion thing, right? I didn't know, but it's a tool. It's actually a tool that people can use, and coaches and therapists and psychologists can equip people that they're working with to use. Something that I use with folks now all the time. But at the time, I just
Mm-hmm.
literally just basically got bored on a mountainside in a cabin and stumbled into this thing. And so
Yeah.
um, now, for me, almost 3 years later, this is sort of my daily state: is to come in and out of a deeper connection with my consciousness, to be aware
Mm-hmm.
of ways that my values are coming up for me in real time, in moments throughout my day. And I'm able to get to that place of connection with my higher self very quickly. If I'm
Mm-hmm.
triggered by things that happen, which we all are, there's never a point where the healing journey is over, and that's one of the beautiful parts about it. Um, but I'm able to actually pause, regulate, evaluate what's actually going on for myself, and begin to ask deeper questions about why is my body giving me a sign that I'm uncomfortable? What could be
Mm-hmm.
this? And I can now do this without swerving off the road if I'm driving, or without completely shutting down and needing to go away for 7 hours into the cabin. But it's a skill that I stumbled into. It's a tool that I stumbled into, and I've developed it into something that is a part of my way of being in this meat suit that I'm in, and
Mm-hmm.
that I help other people use as well.
Yeah. But first, a word from our sponsor. Welcome to Self Reflections, real people, real reflections. Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to do it alone. We're not just your average service. A space to come home to yourself one session at a time. A sanctuary where you feel seen, heard, and held. We meet you where you are, online or in person. Providing support across the lifespan from little ones to adults. nurturing your mind, body, and relationships. Real people, real reflections. Book now at selfreflections.com. Rob, I've been actually making notes as you're speaking because there's so many valuable points that that you've made. Firstly, I want to go back to medication. Normally, we want clients to have or individuals to have the variety of services or methods or tools or things that help them along the journey. And some people are all for it, some people are not. Honestly, it's such a unique and personal choice to everyone's journey. And at times it might help you at a certain, point of what you're struggling with, and then it no longer serves you. And that is something we want to normalize as an ongoing need to discuss, to communicate, and to explore what those options are. I really love that you identified this because this is so common, and I often explain this to my clients if they're ever curious about medication or they are already on it. Medication is like a clamp on our emotional experience, and when we have emotions like this sometimes, especially if we've been exposed to trauma. So having that clamp helps kind of regulate us for a period of time to then make sense of things, to actually be able to practice some strategies to kind of get the cogs turning. If the clamp is too much, we don't feel emotions. We're not really having the human experience. And that's usually if it's the wrong medication, if it's too high of a dose, and so forth and so on. We want to kind of normalize that, you have every right to communicate what that looks like. And I love that you identified that you weren't able to connect to your emotional experience. And what we know in any form of healing, we want to feel emotions. We want to get better at tolerating them. We want to get better at regulating our nervous system when things set us off. So at times, medication can help, but it's very much used as a crutch. It's not the sole thing that we're going to use to try and heal and work through how our body reacts to certain things. So I appreciate you mentioning it. The other thing that I made a note on is you put yourself in a certain situation where you had no distractions. Majority of us are absolutely petrified to sit with ourself, to sit with our thoughts, and to see what comes up. We very much are addicted to everything and anything in the external world to just keep going. And we sometimes name that as, oh, I'm just busy, or I'm just living, and we don't actually have the capacity within ourselves to actually be in the stillness and quiet. And what you described there is that it does take time and energy for it to actually get to a point where it slowly starts to feel a little bit more comfortable. And your description of noticing that you are not your thoughts and you are not your experience, that you exist somewhere in the background. And I want to highlight a book that was just like the Body Keeps the Score was a pivotal book for you that completely changed the trajectory of your life. A book for me was The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer.
Yeah.
It blew my mind, and it really, really encapsulates exactly what you've identified there is knowing that there is a us that exists outside of our thoughts, outside of our experience. And I love that you had the capacity and opportunity to be able to, with time and patience, to be able to develop that with yourself and start to connect to your higher consciousness and the existence of you beyond all the external, right? And even though thoughts, yes, are internal, they're still separate to that part of you that's actually in there, that is genuinely the part that through our human existence, that's our purpose. That's our journey. We want to slowly start to teach ourselves how to connect on a deeper level to that part for us. That then helps us make sense of the world, make sense of who we are, and how we then be of service for ourselves and the benefit of, our human existence.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, I've always been someone who wanted to ask deeper questions than the context typically supported. Questions about the ultimate nature of reality have always fascinated me. I was one of the many people in my seminary that would like to talk about the movie The Matrix, but it wasn't allowed. And so Right. So I guess, that there was a moment in that
Mm,
hour of that 7 hour, discovery that was sort of like I'm getting to do that with myself. And it was very safe for me. Everybody's journey is going to have a different flavor. Not everybody has a bachelor's in philosophy, and is, super into questions of ultimate reality. But at the end of
mm,
the day, knowing your own reality is worth
mm,
discomfort of sitting
mhm.
with yourself.
Hmm. And I love that you made reference to the Matrix. My husband, if he hears this episode, he'd be like, "Yes, exactly." Yeah. We're very big fans of the Matrix. He more so when it came out, he understood everything. Where for me, it took me like 10,000 times of rewatching it for me to connect the dots. But it is such an interesting reference that you make to exactly what we're trying to kind of connect in our conversation today. It's the ultimate power that we do have within our own capabilities. So yeah, great reference.
Yeah, it's always been a passion of mine, I think, to try to connect art to my own journey. And, I mentioned my music. Uh,
Mm,
it turned out there's been a number of artists over the course of my life that I listened to that were not actually consistent with my outward values and, my persona as a Christian, and as a pastor, but that were planting seeds that were able to germinate and grow and bear fruit once I began to take the shackles off of my life and actually reflect on who I am. And so I'm very grateful for those who make art and put it out into the world. Multimedia art, such as film. I mean, I could name off a bunch of films, that have been very helpful to me. But music
mm,
to me is a big one, and I'm grateful to be able to make
mhm,
my own art, my own music, and to share it with the world now as well. And hopefully, it will help people in their journeys to
mm,
be more comfortable asking different questions, to find a sense of solidarity that there's another human being that has some idea what I might be experiencing. And I think
mm,
art can really serve a role that even a conversation with another human being can't. It
mhm,
provokes our own ability to connect with our higher self. And I think that there's something really special about the creative process and the ultimate meaning of what all of this is about that is connected to
mhm,
the experience that an observer of the art also has with that art. And I think that's a really, really beautiful thing.
mm. Yes, agree. Rob, the death of an identity can very much be a as traumatic as an external loss that we might have in our life. Many people do fear this stage because it's genuinely it feels like we're losing everything. And it's also where the biggest transformations do happen. How did you navigate the actual discomfort of stepping into the unknown that you could share with our community if they're curious, or potentially fearful of that exact discomfort as part of the journey?
Yeah, I always say to people that I had to lose myself in order to find myself.
Yeah.
And a good portion of that process was started because of the implications of destructive behaviors in my life that
Hmm.
were directly related to my disconnection from myself and my attempt to medicate and survive. And so I just want to underscore again that catastrophe is not necessary for this journey, um, but there is a parallel sort of when you realize, and I realized at some point, I was in the process of losing myself, right? I was in the process of the things that I had held most dearly and certainly projected out into the world as who I was, that those very things were actually going away. And
Hmm.
that I was going to, on some level, need to cope with that, figure out how I wanted to be. And I think
Mm.
the biggest piece of it,
And that's so important. Sorry to cut you off there. And that's so important when we try and understand what it is, what it means like to actually live authentically,
yeah,
right? I love that you've identified it there.
yeah, and I just want to encourage people to who might be going through this, or if you're helping people that are going through this,
Mm.
um, to be open to actually intentionally building your life. Because what happens, and happened partially in my experience, and what happens oftentimes is people get into a state well, I'm learning what I'm not, or what I'm not anymore isn't working, but I have no idea even how to build this thing back. In the process of transitioning out of high control religion, we call it deconstruction, where you're actually
Mm.
deconstructing your faith and your identity. Unfortunately, a great many more resources exist on deconstruction than reconstruction.
Right. Yeah.
So,
Hmm.
we're now a pile of parts in the floor. What do we do with the parts? How do you determine which parts aren't even the ones you want? And so this is where being able to check in with myself through consciousness expansion, through presence with every moment that I'm in, just the ability to pause, to regulate my nervous system, to get in touch with my higher self and my values. It became such an integral practice to this reconstruction of building a life around who I actually believe that I am. And it is
Hmm.
not a process you complete. It is not a process that you go, hey, I've arrived. It's all done. I've got a nice little package. In fact, I would argue that if you believe your life is a perfect package, then there is some dissociation involved to get to that place when if you
Mm.
got it all sorted out, it's necessary to be somewhat dissociated from your higher, healthier self in order to believe that, because this human experience is just too messy. It's just too dynamic.
Hmm.
There's too much going on. And another thing that I just want to bring in here is what I believe uh, is sort of the final major piece of the worldview puzzle for me. And that is
Hmm.
the link between neuroscience, quantum physics, and the daily life.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you saw the movie Oppenheimer, you get a little window into the way the science community was reacting to and building things out of the ideas that Albert Einstein and the physicists studying the nature of reality were discovering in the first
Yeah.
part of the 1900s. And so, um, what you discover if you look deeply into the way that the science was being dealt with is that there was quite a bit of disagreement about how meaningful any of it actually was, and whether there was any intrinsic meaning or value, or whether it was just practical value. Okay, we can build bombs, it's practical value.
Hmm.
Okay? We can make unending energy sources, practical value. But this question of, does this have anything to say about the nature of reality in general and the daily reality of every human being? And I would argue that it does, in fact, have quite a bit to say about that. The very subatomic particles that make up this reality are almost exclusively made of energy, and they also
Yes.
only exist in states that they are observed in. So the observer observing the subatomic particle actually creates the state of that subatomic particle, meaning we are literally controlling our experience around us. And
Hmm.
the idea of what we experience in everyday life is actually being created by us,
Hmm.
and I think that that's really important to understand. The
Hmm.
way that the brain works as a prediction machine to protect us, to create
Hmm.
experiences that we already understand and that make sense to us. Um,
Hmm.
if we understand the power that we have in our own reality, we start to have a completely different view of every moment, and
Hmm.
ability to actually engage with our world in a place of power, not as merely one who receives experiences. We're actually creating them for ourselves.
I love that you've referred to the energy and the substance of every single thing in this human experience. I think those who know me both in a professional and more so in my personal setting, aligning with our energy and being that's how am I trying to explain this? Aligning with understanding that we are energy, we are vibrations, emotions we are experiencing are things that get stuck energetically within us. Our experience of the world, again, is very much a representation of what's happening in our internal world. I love that you've identified this, and I'm not trying to overwhelm our listeners or community if this doesn't align with you, but it's also something when we look at quantum physics, when we look at, science, when we look at just our human existence, and the more and more information we are getting on the depths of us as beings, and then also in our existence, I think you've hit a very, very interesting topic that maybe we can circle back to on a deeper level in a separate episode, but I very much align with what you're referring to there.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a rabbit hole we could go down and spend hours. And it is definitely a topic that is surrounded by a ton of debate. Um,
Mm,
and one of the main reasons is there are a lot of people that believe in theory that quantum physics is
mm,
key to understanding reality, but have trouble experiencing the power that it supposedly unlocks.
yeah.
And so I think that's an interesting topic. But I just, for today's purposes and in the context of my story, in my own experience, the way that I relate to myself becomes the way the world relates to me. And I have noticed this as I have come to believe what I do about the nature of reality, which again has always been one of my favorite topics, going back
Mm,
to the Three Matrix days, and my bachelor's degree in philosophy. And I think one of the key connecting points to anyone that is on a healing journey, and I would argue very specifically, in the area that I help people, which is in religious trauma and deconstruction, your beliefs shape your consciousness and your consciousness shapes your reality. And so if
yeah.
you have beliefs about yourself or about the world, then you can only be conscious of and therefore experience what is consistent with those beliefs. And so um, recognizing that your beliefs are the single most powerful variable in what you experience as a human being because of that is a really, really critical juncture. And I don't care where anybody comes from, what their perspective belief systems are. I would love to engage with anybody on this topic of the importance of as the arbiter of
Mm-hmm,
experience, because I
mm-hmm,
think there are a number of avenues and language sets that are very open-ended, and we don't have to go down the quantum physics rabbit hole necessarily, but that is a vital conversation for anyone that is seeking self-healing and self-growth, to understand the role, not just that broken beliefs or bad beliefs have, but all beliefs, specific
mm-hmm,
beliefs have
mm-hmm.
experience.
And I couldn't agree more. I think even if I look at the basic fundamentals of psychology, thoughts influence emotions, influence behavior. It's integrated in absolutely everything. We just call it something different, or it fits within a model that's unique to that industry. So I think you beautifully articulated that for us today, and it'll definitely be a topic that we explore further. If you're interested, as always, put comments down below, set your questions, so that Rob and I can circle back to it at another time. Many people fear stepping into themselves, or their true selves, because they are afraid of judgment and failure at times. What advice would you give to someone who feels stuck in a life that isn't authentic to them?
When the pain of staying the same gets to be worse than the pain you fear through change, you will choose change.
Yeah, that's so powerful.
And at the end of the day, that choice, followed by keeping your word to yourself to maintain that choice, is to your human experience what oxygen is to the body. And you will not go wrong, though you may not have ease, especially in the early stage. You will not go wrong by choosing yourself, choosing to know yourself, and discounting the view that other people may have of your experience in that process, that you really won't go wrong. And just be very careful whose voices you listen to,
Mm-hmm.
and make sure
Mm-hmm.
they are not functioning as an abuser. Make sure that they are not functioning as an external source of authority in your life. Because once you give authority for your healing journey or your sense of identity or your beliefs, heaven help us, to anything external to us, we are in a form of self betrayal. And what we
Mm-hmm.
experience as a result will follow accordingly.
Mm-hmm. That's so true, Rob. I love the way that you've put that forward, because it highlights to people there have been times, and I could resonate even with past experiences where my pain of doing what I was doing was very much overwhelming, and it stopped making sense. And the fear then wasn't no longer fear, it was an undeniable choice of I have to do this for myself. And I think, you know, we can all relate to that in different ways at different points of our life. And when we look at some of these changes, some of the changes might be small, and others might be actually quite profound and quite significant for us. And they are sometimes the make or break trajections that we go on in this beautiful thing we call the human experience that keeps developing and expanding who we are and connecting us deeper within our in ourselves in that experience.
Yeah,
Mm.
and I just want to underscore everything that you've said and what I've said is that every choice is ultimately either about fear or love. And if we choose love over fear, we might have unfortunate parts to the path, but the path is still a path of love. And
Mhm.
and so my encouragement to all on this human experience is to choose love. And that sounds really cheesy and super simple, but in choosing love, I simply mean to choose the path that is within
Mhm.
and to
Mhm.
love yourself and to have patience with yourself, forgive yourself, to grow through all of that requires a kind of love that rejects fear. And our experiences of fear, which for me was very much about the traumatic adaptations and the constant dysregulation and the responses that my body existed in. Once I began to sort of detangle from that, I was able to become conscious of the choices that I was making, either fear or love, fear or love, fear.
Mhm.
Even today, I had an opportunity to choose fear or love, and became aware that I was choosing fear in the situation.
Yeah.
And I mean, this journey is so beautiful. It's a tapestry of experience, and
Mhm.
it's never over. And I'm thankful for that. I'm thankful that
Mhm.
every day for the rest of my life, I will have the opportunity to choose love over fear, and to learn and grow and heal.
Mhm. Mhm. If you could go back and talk to yourself at your lowest point, Rob, what would you say?
You are loving awareness. You are loving awareness. That is who you are. That is what you are. I would say that to myself hanging from that balcony. I would say that
Yeah.
at all of the moments where I'm like, I don't even know why I'm here. I have a song that I wrote called From the Bottom, and it's a reflection on those moments. It's a reflection on the fact that only at that point, because I looked within myself and was honest about the things that I needed to change, that I could be able to find the hope that has brought me forward from that point. There's a lot more in the song. Believing that I am, my nature is as loving awareness has made all the difference. And I would tell myself,
Mhm. That's very beautiful and very powerful. Thank you. What does living authentically look like for you now, Rob?
well, it's a project.
Mhm.
It's a constant dynamic flow of moments and experiences and joys and triggers. And for
Yeah.
me, it looks like being able to pause when I need to, regulate, examine my consciousness, connect with my values, including in the moments of great joy. And recently, I've begun telling my story as I am on the show here today, and telling the whole story about the changes that have occurred in my life. And so that's a huge part of it. And a large part of it is my music. And
Mhm.
sharing my music with the world ultimately is the most authentic expression that I have of being loving awareness. And so for all you artists out there, do not neglect your art. Don't do it. Cultivate it. It is part of you. It is your connection to yourself. Even if nobody
Yeah.
buys it, watches it, listens to it, it's not really for other people. Ultimately, it's for you,
Mm.
from you, to give to whomever, however, whenever. And so For me, that's authenticity.
Oh, and that's so powerful. And even as you were saying it, like parts of my inner self just lit up. It's interesting how people come into our life and just small little snippets can really resonate and kind of remind us of what we may have been forgetting to remind ourselves. So, on behalf of the community and obviously on behalf of myself, I thank you for even just sharing that little momentary snippet with us. You've turned a lot of your pain into something meaningful, and I obviously will share all of your details down below, but how can people connect with you and your work?
Yeah, you can find me by my name on Instagram or Facebook. And then I have a website at robconnolly.net. And any of your listeners and community that would like to find my music, you can find. Currently, I have 3 songs published anywhere you listen to music, and getting ready to launch an album project. So we'll be putting more music into the world.
Amazing. Rob, thank you so much for your honesty and for sharing your journey with us. It has been a privilege to have this conversation.
I can't thank you enough. It's been a great gift to me as well.
And for our community, thank you for tuning into the Self Reflections podcast. If you found value in today's episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below to share your thoughts. Until next time, take care and keep reflecting.